Hi guys, Dennis here, and welcome to iOS CoreData Part 1. We're going to build an app that displays patients by their name and provides a drill down to each of their prescriptions. In essence, this is how I started RX Manager, which is a prescription drug reminder and tracker that is available from the App Store. There's a link on my About page if you're interested in seeing the final application. We'll want to save the data that we add, so to accomplish that we'll be using CoreData. It's a common misconception that CoreData is a database application. It does persist data to the disk, but it also does so much more. Think of CoreData as a framework designed to manage your data. It's highly efficient in that it eliminates most of the boilerplate code that you may be familiar with in most database applications. It's also highly flexible, allowing for changes to the functionality of the data model. This application will use a one-to-many relationship between patients and their prescriptions. In other words, a single patient could have many prescriptions. I'll be introducing several key components of CoreData, which we'll use to populate our table view. I'm assuming that you've had at least an introduction to CoreData in some form or another. Maybe you picked up a book or watched another video, or something to that effect. You'll get much more out of this if you've had that minimum exposure. So in part 1, we're going to lay the groundwork for our project, which includes adding 2 table views and 2 view controllers. We'll also add the labels and text boxes on each of those that we'll be needing. I'm assuming that if you're at the point of learning CoreData, you're fairly comfortable with setting up what will be covered in this video. So I'll be moving through this quickly in the interest of saving time. In part 2, we'll start off with creating our data model and then get into the nitty-gritty of CoreData. So let's get at it. Okay, let's go ahead and open up Xcode and we'll start a new project. And we'll be using an empty application and build everything that we need from scratch. So click Next. And we'll call this CoreData. We can leave our class prefix blank, but make sure the devices have been set to iPhone and use CoreData and automatic reference counting have been checked. Click Next and create, and we have our project. So first order of business, let's add a storyboard. And we'll do a command N and user interface and add a storyboard. And make sure the device family is set to iPhone. And we'll call our storyboard main storyboard. Okay, now let's go ahead and jump over to our app delegate implementation file. Let's select all the text that's in our first method. The application did finish launching with options. Let's go ahead and delete all that. We'll go back to our project settings, and in our project summary under iPhone, iPod deployment, let's set the main storyboard drop down to main storyboard, and this just ensures that our storyboard loads. Let's jump back over to our storyboard and let's start bringing in the objects that we'll need. And as I indicated in the opening remarks, we're going to need 2 table view controllers. There's one, and there's the other, and we'll also need 2 regular view controllers. There's one, and there's the other. Okay, let's embed our first table view in a navigation controller, and to do that we click on Editor, Embed in Navigation Controller. Okay, and this also gives us a navigation bar. So let's go ahead and title our first table view controller Patients. This is the view controller that's going to list all our patients by name. This next table view controller, let's create a transition from our cell to the controller, and that'll be a push transition. And once again we have a nav bar, so let's call this prescriptions. And this view controller will be listing all our prescriptions that are associated with individual patients. Okay, we're going to need we're going to need one bar button on each of these, so let's go ahead and start with our patients, and we'll do a search on button and we'll drag a bar button over, and we're going to change the style to Actually, we're going to change the identifier rather to add. That'll change it to a plus. Then we're going to drag from that button to our first view controller. Release, and this will be a modal transition, so select modal, and then let's click on the identifier, and we'll call this identifier add patient. And we're going to change the transition style to flip horizontal. That'll make for a more attractive transition. Let's go back down to our prescription table view controller. We're going to add a bar button on that. We'll change the identifier to add, and then we're going to do the same thing with our other view controller. Drag that, and this will be a modal transition. And we're going to click on our identifier, and this will be add prescription. We want to make sure that we spell it right. And we're going to change the transition style on this one as well to flip horizontal. Okay, let's go back up to our first view controller, and we want to embed that in a navigation controller as well. So editor, embed in navigation controller. Let's do the same for our other view controller, editor, embed in navigation controller. Now we have a nav bar for both of these. Let's go to the first one, and this one will be entitled add patient. We're going to add two buttons on this controller. There's one, there's our other. First one, we're going to change the identifier to cancel, and the second one we'll change the identifier to save. So this will be our cancel and save button. We're going to do exactly the same thing for our other view controller. This one will be called add prescription, and we'll need two bar buttons. There's one, there's the other. First one we'll change the identifier to cancel, and the second one we'll change the identifier to save. Okay, let's go ahead and add the labels and text fields that we'll need. So let's get our labels on. We'll do a search for labels. And as we'll use our alignments, there's one. And while we're here, let's click on this view controller, and let's go over to the file inspector, and we're going to deselect use auto layout, and that'll happen project wide now. We won't be using auto layout. That's a subject for another video, so deselect that. Now we'll go back to our identity inspector. So there's one label, there's the other. Now we need a couple of text fields, and there's one, and there's the other. And we're just going to stretch these guys out. The exact size doesn't matter. We just want them large enough to where we could add a first and last name. There, okay. And speaking of which, let's go ahead and change the label. This first one will be patient first name followed by a colon. The second one will be patient last name. Okay, and we're going to jump over to our add prescription, and we're going to do something very similar. Let's get our two text boxes on here first, since we already have that selected. And now let's drag two labels on. There's our first, and there's our second. And once again, we just need to size these so they can hold the kind of information that we're going to stick in there. So the size isn't too critical here. Now the first label we're going to entitle prescription name, followed by a colon. And actually, let's capitalize that. Used to writing attributes there. And the second one will be called instructions. Second one will be called prescriptions instructions, and we'll put a colon there. Okay, So let's build and run, see what we have so far. And this looks good. We have the telltale signs of our table view. Let's see if our transition works. It does flip. Now our two buttons won't work yet. They haven't been coded, so the canceller save does not work. So we can't go much further, so let's go ahead and close that. We'll also close our inspectors panel. Okay, before we start creating our class files, there's one more thing that we should do while we're here, and that's name our cells in our table view. So let's click on Patients, open up our Utilities panel, and let's click on our cell. And it's important that we use a reuse identifier. So we're going to use a capital CELL for this guy, and we're going to do the same for our prescription cell, capital CELL. Okay, we're ready to add our class file, so let's go ahead and jump over to our project navigator, and we'll start off with the Command N, and under Cocoa Touch Objective-C class we'll click Next, and this first one will be Patients Table View Controller. We want to make sure that it's a subclass of UI Table View Controller, so let's change that. Click Next and Create, and we have that one. Our next one, Command N, click Next, will be a Prescriptions Table View Controller. And we want to make sure it's a subclass of UI Table View Controller. Click Next and Create. And now we need two regular UI View Controllers, so Command N. And this first one will be for Add Patient View Controller, and we need to change our subclass to UI View Controller. And then the last one, Command N, will be for our Add Prescription View Controller. Click Next, Create, and now we have our view controllers. So now we need to assign these class files that we just created to the appropriate view controller. So let's jump over to our storyboard, and we'll start off with our Patients Table View Controller, and we'll go to the Identity Inspector, and under Custom Class, do the drop down for class and assign this the Patients Table View Controller. We'll do the same with Prescriptions Table View Controller. We'll scroll up, and under Add Patient, make sure that we have Add Patient selected there, and under Add Prescription, make sure that Add Prescription has been selected. Okay, now that we've assigned all those class files to our controllers, we can use the Assistant Editor and start creating our properties. So let's start off with the Add Patient. We'll close out our Utilities panel, and we'll open up our Assistant Editor. We're going to need a couple of outlets and a couple of IB actions. So let's start with our outlets first, and we'll do a control drag, and this first outlet will be patient first name, and make sure it's spelled correctly. Okay, and the second one, control drag, this will be patient last name. Alright, now we need two IB actions. First one for our cancel button, control drag. We need to make sure that this is an IB action and the name is cancel. And we'll change our type to UI bar button item. Click connect. And our last one, save. Change that to an IB action. It'll be called save. Change the type to UI bar button item and connect. Let's go down to our Add Prescription View Controller, and we'll do basically the same thing. Let's make sure that we have the right one in our... Here we go, now we have the right one. Okay, give ourselves some room, and we're going to need, once again, two outlets and two actions. So control drag. This first one will be prescription name, and you want to really be careful on the spelling on these because it's kind of a hassle to go back and change it if you make an error. So prescription name, connect, and then we'll do a control drag, and this one will be prescription instructions. And connect, and then we need two actions. First one will be cancel. Let's change the type to bar button, and then we need a save. Change it to an action. Change the type to bar button. Okay. Okay, so you may be thinking, I know what he's going to do next. He's going to go over to the implementation file and code that cancel and save method. And you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to utilize the power of subclassing by creating another file that will code our cancel and save methods along with some CoreData methods. Now, since we only have two view controllers in our app, we could easily code those methods in their corresponding class files. But imagine if we had a half or a dozen or so view controllers. That'd be a lot of coding, and the more code you have to write, the more likely you are to have errors. So in this case, less is better. So to do that, let's close out our Assistant Editor first, and let's jump over to our Project Navigator, and we'll do a Command N. And we're going to create another Objective-C class file, and we're going to call this file Core View Controller, and it needs to be a subclass of UI View Controller, since those are the two types of controllers we're going to implement this in. So let's click Next and Create, and we have our class file. So let's start with the header. So in the header, we need to add a couple of methods, our cancel and save method, that will be accessible by any controller that's subclassing this file. So let's go ahead and add those methods here, and that'll be a void, and we'll call the first one cancel and dismiss, and the second one will be a save and dismiss. So let's jump over to the implementation file and code those two methods. We'll have to jump over to the bottom here, and the first one is a cancel, and we'll need a couple of curly braces. And the second one, let's give me some room here, and the second one is our save method, and once again we need a couple of curly braces. So there's more code that's going to be added to these two methods once we get involved with CoreData, but for right now we're just going to add a statement that'll be able to dismiss the Modal view controller. So that'll simply be dismiss Modal view controller, and we'll do a yes and then a nil. Let's go ahead and just copy this, and we're going to use the same thing for our save and dismiss right now. Okay, now let's jump back over to our Add Patient View Controller. And the first thing that we need to do is import that Core View Controller. So let's do an import statement. And we're going to import that Core View Controller header file. And then you see that we're inheriting here currently from UI View Controller. We want to change that to our Core View Controller. Now we can go into the implementation, and we'll go down to our cancel and save methods, and now we'll code those. This time we'll call super. In other words, we're going to be calling the parent class file, and we'll just call cancel and dismiss. And for our save, we'll call super save and dismiss. Okay, let's build and run. We ought to be able to dismiss the Add Patient View Controller now. And there's our view controller. That looks good. Let's click on our Add Patient View Controller, And there's our first name and last name. Let's try the cancel button. That dismisses. Let's open it back up and try the save button, and that dismisses. Doesn't do anything but dismiss right now, but you see what we've done with the power of subclassing. And let's go ahead and do the same thing with our add prescriptions. So once again, we need to import our core view controller header and then change from inheriting from UI view controller to our core view controller. And now we can go ahead and code our cancel and save methods. Once again, we're going to call super, and in this case we'll call the supers cancel and dismiss, and then under the save we'll call super save and dismiss. Okay, so we have both our view controllers coded now. Okay, there's a few things that we can touch upon that have to do with CoreData before we wind up part 1. And we'll get more involved in that in part 2 when we really start to get into the nitty-gritty. But first of all, let's go over and take a look at our app delegate just to see what CoreData has given us. And we see here that we now have 3 new properties. We have an NS Manage Object Context, which is really the beating heart of CoreData. We have the NS Manage Modal and our Persistent Store Coordinator. We're going to talk more about all of these a little further in the video presentation. Let's take a look at our implementation file, and we now have, if we scroll down a little bit, we'll see what's called the CoreData stack. And we can just go through here. The first one is the Manage Object Context, and that returns the Manage Object Context for the application. And if it doesn't already exist, it's created, along with the Persistent Store Coordinator. We have the Manage Object Model. Once again, if it doesn't already exist, we're creating it here. And the Persistent Store Coordinator. And if we scroll down, you notice that this is a SQLite application, which is quite typical with CoreData. So that's all the extra text that's added when you check that Add CoreData checkbox when you're creating the project, and you see it's quite a bit of extra code. You wouldn't want to have to go back and add all this manually. So it's good that if you know you're going to be using CoreData, go ahead and check that up front, and it's all added for you. So I mentioned there's a couple of more things that we can do before we wrap up part 1, and that has to do with our core view control that we just created. So let's jump over there, and we're going to jump over to the implementation part of that file. And in this file, we're going to need to have access to the CoreData stack that we just looked at. So what we're going to do first is create an import statement and import that app delegate header. The next thing we want to do is we want to create a property for our Manage Object Context. So let's do an app property. This will be non-atomic and strong, and this will be an NS Manage Object Context, and we're just going to call this Manage Object Context. Okay, so we're going to need to grab a reference to the Manage Object Context in our app delegate, and to do that we need to implement the Manage Object Context method. So let's do that right below the first init statement, give ourselves some room. And this is written NS Manage Object Context, and we need a pointer there. Manage Object Context and a couple of curly braces. Now this method will return a Manage Object Context, and we'll have to write some really ugly code here, so let me write it out first and then I'll explain what we're doing. Okay, so what we have here is we're using the UI application class to find the shared application. Then we ask for its delegate. We then cast it as our app delegate, and then call the Manage Object Context, and then return that. And all this ugly code allows us to refer to our Manage Object Context by using self.manageObjectContext. Undoubtedly, this is something that you'll want to add to your code snippets because it's easily forgotten. Okay, let's go back down to our cancel and dismiss method now. And you'll see when we code our segue from the patient's table view controller to our add patient view controller that we'll be passing a new patient object. So we can't just dismiss our view controller when we click cancel. We have to remove that new object that was created. So we use the instance method rollback to accomplish that. So we need to add a bracket self dot manage object context rollback, and that takes care of that one. Okay, let's go ahead and code our save and dismiss method, and this time I'm going to use my code snippets and just grab that code out of there. So let's open up our utility panel. My code library is already there, and I'll do a search on save, and there's our save and dismiss. So let me bring that over, and we'll put it right there. Close it out, and I'll just walk through this. Okay, so once again, perfect example of something that you'll probably add to your personal code snippets. So what we're doing here is calling the save method on the manage object context. We'll start off by creating an NS error reference and setting its value to nil. Next, we'll be using a compound if statement to check to see if the MOC has any changes. Then we'll call the save method, which returns the bool, so we'll test for the negative. And so if it's negative, we'll go ahead and print an error log with the localized description. Else, we'll print a log that says save succeeded. And this is very useful in our build out of our application, so we'll be able to tell whether or not our items that we're saving have actually been saved to the manage object context. Okay, let's just do a final build and run for part 1 just to make sure that we don't have any errors here. And our table view loads. Let's click on our add patient. Cancel button works. Save button works, although we don't have any information for either one of those yet. Looks like everything is working fine. Okay, that wraps it up for part 1 of CoreData. In part 2, we'll dive deep into implementing our CoreData methods. So I'll see you there, and please don't forget to subscribe.